Chapter 1. The Strange Human Condition. Catherine Vell had spent years studying the behaviors of different species across the galaxy, fascinated by the countless ways intelligent life had evolved. She had encountered creatures that communicated through scent, beings who could see into different dimensions, and civilizations that had existed long before her own people even learned to forge metal. And yet, despite all of this, nothing had confused her more than humans. They were an anomaly, primitive in some ways, incredibly advanced in others. They could survive in environments that would kill most species, adapt to almost anything, and endure injuries that should have been fatal. They lacked natural armor, psionic capabilities, or regenerative abilities, yet they had conquered countless worlds through sheer stubbornness and ingenuity. They were unpredictable, irrational, and often reckless, yet they managed to thrive in ways that defied logic. But the most baffling thing, the one thing that made no sense whatsoever, was the fact that humans just shut down for an entire portion of the planetary cycle. She had first noticed this when she was assigned as an observer aboard a mixed-species diplomatic vessel, where she was expected to work alongside a human named Ethan Voss, a mechanical specialist who had been brought aboard to assist with ship maintenance. Catherine had assumed, at first, that he was like many other species, one that would take rest cycles in short intervals, staying alert even while conserving energy. But she was wrong, because humans didn't just rest. They went into a full biological shutdown, disappearing into a state of total unconsciousness for hours at a time. And no matter how many times she observed this phenomenon, it never stopped being disturbing. The first time she saw it happen, she thought he had died. It had been 3 days since Ethan had boarded the diplomatic ship Aurora's Veil, and despite her initial skepticism, Catherine had quickly realized he was competent in his work. The ship's engine systems, normally a delicate and temperamental structure, seemed to obey him in ways that defied probability, and his knowledge of reactor cores, gravitational stabilizers, and FTL drives was unexpectedly thorough. Despite being an alien to the majority of the crew, he had adapted shockingly well, even managing to befriend some of the more reserved species aboard a feat that even Catherine had struggled with. She had watched him work with fascination, taking mental notes on his strange behavior, his habit of joking even when under stress, his ability to eat food that should have been biologically incompatible, and his frustratingly casual attitude toward danger. But the strangest moment came when she walked into the ship's engineer lounge late one evening, only to find him motionless on one of the seating platforms. At first, she had assumed something was wrong. His breathing was slow, his posture completely still, his facial muscles relaxed in a way that suggested total biological inactivity. She had seen some species enter trance-like states before, but this was different. This wasn't meditation, nor was it any kind of psionic restoration process. It was a complete, unnatural shutdown. Her first instinct was to check his vitals. Approaching carefully, she reached out and pressed her fingers against the side of his throat, searching for a pulse. And then, "What the hell are you doing?" She flinched violently, her spines along the back of her neck rising in alarm as Ethan's eyes snapped open, his voice thick with confusion. She stepped back immediately, her mind racing. "You were unresponsive. I was checking for biological failure." Ethan groaned, rubbing his face. "Biological failure? You mean sleep?" Catherine's brow furrowed. "You shut down fully for several hours. How is that not dangerous?" Ethan stared at her as if she had just asked why ships needed engines. "It's not dangerous. It's just sleep." She folded her arms, still watching him with suspicion. "You are unconscious. That is dangerous. What if you are attacked? What if the ship enters crisis conditions? How can your species afford such a vulnerability?" Ethan let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "I don't know what to tell you. That's just how humans work. We need sleep." Catherine was not satisfied with that answer. She had encountered species that entered rest states, yes, but never to this extreme. Most maintained partial awareness, their brains still alert to external stimuli even when in stasis. Others rested in short bursts, never fully unconscious for more than a few moments at a time. But humans? Humans just turned off. She narrowed her eyes at him. "What if I had stolen something from you? What if I had attacked you?" Ethan shrugged. "I guess I'd be screwed." She stared at him in horror. "How has your species survived?" Ethan stretched, yawning as if this conversation wasn't the most disturbing thing she had ever experienced. I don't know, but we're still here. Kethery's mind raced with questions, but before she could ask them, Ethan laid back down, completely unfazed by the entire exchange. Now, if you don't mind, I'm going back to sleep. I'll answer more of your weird alien questions in the morning. Kethery stayed there for several minutes, watching as he drifted back into unconsciousness, his breathing slow and steady, his body once again entering that vulnerable state of inactivity. She had spent her entire life studying alien species. She had observed creatures who could survive in the vacuum of space, beings who could regenerate entire limbs in seconds, civilizations that had conquered the secrets of time manipulation and interdimensional travel. And yet, somehow, humans still managed to be the strangest thing she had ever encountered. She didn't know whether to be impressed or terrified. Perhaps both. Understanding the human mind. Kethery spent the next several weeks attempting to understand human sleep cycles, determined to make sense of this baffling biological flaw. She observed Ethan as often as she could, taking note of how long he slept, how quickly he entered full unconsciousness, how deep his state of inactivity became. She tried testing his awareness levels, dropping objects nearby, making sharp noises, even attempting to move things within his vicinity. He remained oblivious. It was deeply unsettling. She asked him endless questions, determined to make sense of this behavior. How do you know when to wake up? What happens to your mind during sleep? How do you ensure you will not be ambushed? Ethan's answers were frustratingly simple. Alarms. Dreams. We don't. None of it made sense. To Kethery, humans were walking contradictions, a species that had survived through adaptability and sheer tenacity, yet willingly allowed themselves to become completely vulnerable for a third of their lives. No species should have been able to flourish under such conditions, and yet here they were expanding, thriving, proving themselves as one of the most unpredictable forces in the galaxy. Kethery didn't know how they had done it, but she knew one thing for certain. She would never stop trying to figure them out. Chapter 2. Dreams? What do you mean you hallucinate every night? Kethery Vel prided herself on being a scholar of alien physiology and behavior, a dedicated researcher who had spent decades meticulously documenting the idiosyncrasies of countless species. She had seen life forms that could communicate across solar systems without sound, creatures that could regenerate entire organs in minutes, and civilizations that had eliminated the concept of death altogether. Yet no matter how much she observed Ethan Voss, her assigned human counterpart aboard Aurora's Veil, she found herself increasingly bewildered by his species. The fact that humans completely shut down for extended periods of time, rendering themselves vulnerable to attack and environmental hazards, was already disturbing enough. But when she questioned him further about this absurd behavior, she uncovered something even more baffling. Humans didn't just lose consciousness when they slept. They hallucinated. Every single night. The first discussion of dreams. It was during another one of their late-night encounters in the engineering bay, where Ethan had once again collapsed onto the nearest horizontal surface, fully intending to enter that strange, unresponsive state that he called sleep. Kethery, determined to continue her investigation, had approached him just as he was settling in, her datapad in hand, prepared for another round of questioning. "What do you mean? You see things when you sleep?" she asked, her frilled head crest shifting in confusion. Ethan, who was already half asleep, cracked one eye open with an annoyed sigh. "It's called dreaming, Kethery. You don't have dreams?" She tilted her head, running her fingers across the glowing controls of her datapad. "Not in the way you describe. My species enters a state of partial rest, but our minds remain functional, processing information from the day. We do not fabricate hallucinations." Ethan blinked, rubbing his temples. "They're not hallucinations. It's just, our brains process memories, emotions, sometimes random thoughts. It's not real." Kethery narrowed her eyes. "But you experience them as if they are real?" "Yeah." She stared at him. "That is the definition of a hallucination, Ethan." He groaned. "Look, it's just how our brains work, okay? We sleep, we dream, we wake up. It's normal." "Normal?" Kethery repeated, still clearly baffled. "Your species enters a full biological shutdown, becomes completely defenseless for hours, and during this state, your mind fabricates experiences that do not exist, And you call this normal? Ethan yawned. Yeah, well, what do you want me to say? It's how we process emotions and memories. Sometimes dreams are random. Sometimes they're stressful. Sometimes they're nice. Sometimes they don't make any sense at all. Kethery stared at him, processing this new information. You mean to tell me that not only do humans shut down for a third of their lives, but during this time, you also subject yourselves to fabricated emotional distress, confusion, and illogical experiences? Willingly? Ethan shrugged. I mean, we don't really have a choice. It just happens. Kethery's frilled crest twitched in utter disbelief. That is the most absurd evolutionary trait I have ever encountered. Ethan chuckled, finally sitting up, rubbing his eyes. It's not that bad. Some dreams are fun. Some are weird. Some don't make any sense. Give me an example. Ethan thought for a moment before grinning. Okay, last week I had a dream that I was back on Earth, but instead of gravity, everything was floating, and I was trying to eat a sandwich, but the sandwich kept flying away, so I had to chase it. Kethery blinked at him in pure horror. You experienced an event in which you were unable to acquire necessary sustenance due to your own mind actively working against you, and this is something you consider normal? Ethan laughed. It wasn't real, Kethery. It was just a dream. But you felt emotions during it? Yeah, I was frustrated. You were emotionally affected by something that was not real. Yeah, that's how dreams work. Kethery was silent for a long moment, her eyes narrowing in contemplation. Finally, she exhaled slowly. Your species is an enigma, Ethan Voss. A terrifying, irrational enigma? Ethan grinned, leaning back. You're welcome. The dream experiments. Kethery was not the kind of scientist to simply accept something so ridiculous without further investigation. Over the next few weeks, she conducted several studies on human dreaming, observing Ethan's sleep patterns, tracking his neural activity, and even attempting to analyze the strange brain waves that humans produce during their unconscious state. She recorded his descriptions of his dreams, cataloging each one, trying to find a pattern, a logical explanation. But what she found instead was pure chaos. One night, he dreamed he was running from a giant insect wearing a top hat. Another night, he dreamed that he was back on his home planet, but the sky was green, and the oceans were made of liquid metal. One particularly disturbing night, he woke up in a panic, muttering about being chased through an endless corridor by an unseen entity, something he called a nightmare. You willingly subject yourselves to this level of psychological distress? Kethery had asked, horrified. Again, not willingly. It just happens. And you have no way of controlling it? Some humans can, I guess. But most of us just go along for the ride. Kethery had never encountered a species that seemed so determined to torment itself for no apparent reason. Your mind betrays you every night, and yet you continue to do this? Ethan shrugged. Gotta recharge somehow. Kethery couldn't believe what she was hearing. Humans are insane. Ethan just laughed. Yeah, you're probably right. The final revelation. After weeks of studying, questioning, and attempting to make sense of the utterly illogical phenomenon that was human sleep, Kethery finally came to a conclusion. Humans had somehow evolved to function in a state that was both extremely inefficient and ridiculously dangerous, and yet, they had thrived anyway. Despite their vulnerability, despite their irrational subconscious hallucinations, despite the fact that their own minds often worked against them, they had still managed to become one of the most adaptable, resilient species in the galaxy. She didn't know whether to be impressed or horrified. Probably both. And as Ethan once again settled down for the night, slipping into that peculiar state of unconsciousness, Kethery simply sighed and shook her head. You are the strangest thing I have ever encountered, Ethan Voss. From his half-asleep state, Ethan smirked. Get used to it, Kethery. Humans are full of surprises. Chapter 3. You mean to tell me your brain can just refuse to sleep? Kethery had long since accepted that humans were the most biologically illogical species in the known universe. But every time she thought she had fully mapped out their chaotic nature, Ethan Voss managed to introduce yet another bizarre, horrifying revelation. It had taken her weeks to come to terms with the idea that humans willingly entered a state of total unconsciousness for hours at a time, leaving themselves completely vulnerable to any potential threat, and even longer to accept that during this period, they experienced random, uncontrollable hallucinations known as dreams. That alone was already so ridiculous that she had spent many nights simply staring at her research notes, trying to comprehend how such a species had survived. And yet, when she finally believed she had understood the mechanics of human sleep, Ethan revealed something even worse. Because not only did humans require sleep to function, but sometimes their own brains refused to let them have it. And somehow, this was normal. The discovery of insomnia. It began with a simple observation. For the past several cycles, Kethery had been closely monitoring Ethan's sleep patterns, taking note of how long he rested, how often he dreamt, and how his body reacted to various external stimuli while in this unconscious state. She had gathered extensive data, enough to build a preliminary report on human sleep habits, and while she still found many aspects of the process deeply unsettling, she had at least reached a point where she believed she understood it. Then, one night, she found Ethan awake when he shouldn't have been. She had walked into the engineering lounge where he often collapsed onto one of the seating platforms to sleep only to find him sitting up, his eyes bloodshot, his posture tense, his movements sluggish. At first, she assumed something had happened. A medical emergency? A disturbance on the ship? A critical system failure? But when she scanned the area and found nothing unusual, she focused on the real anomaly, Ethan himself. She tilted her head, narrowing her gaze. "You are awake?" Ethan groaned, rubbing his face with both hands. "Yeah." She stepped closer, carefully observing him. "It is the designated sleep cycle for your species. You should be unconscious." Ethan let out a frustrated sigh, stretching his arms over his head. "Yeah, well, my brain had other plans." Kethery blinked. "Your brain?" He nodded, yawning. "Couldn't sleep?" She frowned. "That does not make sense. Your species requires sleep. Your biological systems should initiate the process automatically." Ethan laughed dryly. "Oh, Kethery, you sweet, innocent alien. You think we get to decide when we sleep? That's adorable." Kethery's brow furrowed. "Elaborate." Ethan slumped forward, propping his elbows on his knees. "Sometimes, no matter how tired we are, no matter how much our bodies need it, our brains just don't let us sleep. It's called insomnia." Kethery stared at him in growing horror. "You are telling me that your own biological functions actively refuse to allow you to enter a necessary state of regeneration?" Ethan shrugged. "Pretty much. And this is normal?" "Yep." Kethery's frilled head crest twitched. "How often does this occur?" Ethan sighed, rubbing his temples. "It depends. Some nights, it's easy. Some nights, my brain decides to replay every embarrassing thing I've ever done for 5 hours instead of letting me sleep. And sometimes, for no reason at all, I just lay there staring at the ceiling, unable to shut off my thoughts." Kethery felt her entire worldview shatter for the third time since meeting Ethan. "You mean to tell me that humans are not only forced into unconsciousness for an extended period of time, but they also occasionally experience random hallucinations, and on top of that, they sometimes become unable to achieve this required state at all?" Ethan gave her a tired grin. "Yep. Welcome to humanity." Kethery let out a long, slow breath. "Your species should not exist." Ethan chuckled. "Yeah, I get that a lot." The impact of sleep deprivation. As a scientist, Kethery was not satisfied with this explanation. She needed to understand the consequences of this malfunction, so she spent the next several cycles documenting Ethan's behavior while he was sleep-deprived. The results were concerning. By the second day, Ethan became noticeably irritable, his usual sarcastic remarks laced with a sharper edge. By the third day, his coordination began to suffer, and he nearly dropped an expensive piece of engine equipment. By the fourth day, his speech became disjointed, and he seemed to forget things mid-sentence. By the fifth day, he was staring at walls for long periods of time, muttering strange phrases to himself. Kethery was deeply alarmed. "Your biological systems are deteriorating," she informed him after watching him accidentally pour coolant into the wrong processing unit. Ethan blinked at her slowly, as if processing her words at half speed. "Yeah, sleep deprivation kinda messes with you." Kethery folded her arms, her tail flicking in irritation. "Then why do you not simply force your body into rest?" Ethan groaned. "If it were that easy, we wouldn't have an entire industry dedicated to helping people fall asleep." Kethery frowned. You require external assistance to maintain normal biological function? Ethan laughed weakly. Yeah. People take sleep meds, drink weird herbal teas, listen to ambient noise recordings. Some even count imaginary farm animals jumping over fences. Kethery stared at him. You hallucinate farm animals to induce unconsciousness? Ethan chuckled. You make it sound way weirder than it is. Kethery narrowed her eyes. It is already the strangest thing I have ever heard, Ethan Voss. He stretched, letting out a loud yawn. You should see what happens when we go multiple days without sleep. People start hallucinating while they're awake. Kethery's expression turned to one of pure, unfiltered horror. Your mind begins fabricating experiences in real time? Ethan nodded. Yup. The human brain is great, isn't it? Kethery took a slow step back. No, it is not. The final conclusion. After weeks of studying human sleep, Kethery came to a final, undeniable conclusion. Humans were an evolutionary paradox. They required sleep, yet they couldn't control when they got it. Their own brains actively fought against them, forcing them into states of mental distress for no reason whatsoever. They could function for extended periods without sleep, but at the cost of severe cognitive impairment and eventual psychosis. And yet, despite all of this, they had thrived as a species, expanding across the galaxy, adapting to impossible environments, outliving and outpacing species with far superior biological designs. Kethery did not understand it. She doubted she ever would. But as she watched Ethan finally pass out after days of sleep deprivation, snoring softly on the engineering bench, she could only shake her head. Your species should not exist, she muttered again. And yet, somehow, against all logic they did. Chapter 4. How are you functioning on only 3 hours of sleep? Kethery Vell had spent months attempting to decipher the sheer biological absurdity that was human sleep. Every discovery she made only led to more questions, more disbelief, and more horrified realizations. She had already come to terms with the bizarre nature of human unconsciousness, how they willingly allowed themselves to be defenseless for hours, how their minds fabricated random hallucinations that sometimes resulted in psychological distress, and how, despite the absolute necessity of sleep, their own brains sometimes refused to allow them to rest. She had observed Ethan Voss, her assigned human counterpart aboard the Aurora's Veil, through cycles of sleep deprivation, mental exhaustion, and the increasingly erratic behaviors that came with an unhealthy lack of rest. She had cataloged the way his coordination suffered, how his cognitive abilities deteriorated, and how he had casually informed her that after a certain point, humans would begin hallucinating while awake. She had believed naively that she had uncovered the full extent of human sleep dysfunction, but she was wrong. Because humans could also function on dangerously low amounts of sleep, and they did so regularly. The morning that changed everything. It began with a simple morning briefing. The diplomatic ship Aurora's Veil had just entered a new planetary system, and the crew was preparing for a standard supply acquisition and diplomatic exchange with the local governing faction. As one of the designated science officers, Kethery had been called to the operations deck to review planetary conditions, while Ethan had been summoned for an engineering status report. She had expected him to arrive as usual, grumbling about how early it was, but otherwise fully functional. Instead, when he walked into the command center, she immediately knew something was wrong. His posture was slightly off, his movements a fraction slower, and when he yawned, it was the kind of yawn that suggested his body was actively attempting to shut down against his will. Kethery narrowed her gaze. How long did you sleep last night? Ethan scratched the back of his head. About 3 hours. She stared at him in absolute horror. You mean to tell me that your species requires an average of 7 to 8 hours of sleep, and you have only obtained 3? Ethan shrugged. Yeah, it happens. Kethery could not believe what she was hearing. And you are still functional? He grinned. Define functional. Kethery's eyes narrowed, her mind immediately shifting into scientific analysis mode. This was unprecedented. You should be incapable of operating at full efficiency. Ethan gave a tired chuckle, rubbing his eyes. Oh, trust me, I'm feeling it. But I'll be fine. She refused to accept that answer. No, you will not be fine. Your cognitive abilities should be impaired, your motor function slowed, your ability to focus severely diminished. Your body should be actively attempting to shut down. Ethan grinned sleepily, leaning against one of the nearby consoles. Yeah, well, humans are used to running on low power. Kethery's head crest twitched in sheer disbelief. That is not how biological systems work, Ethan Voss. You are not a starship. You cannot simply run on low power. He laughed, but she could see the way his body subtly swayed, as if staying upright was an active struggle. She folded her arms, her tail flicking in irritation. How do you intend to maintain operational efficiency with such a severe sleep deficit? Ethan smirked. Caffeine. Kethery blinked. Excuse me? Ethan reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a sealed energy packet, and ripped it open before downing the contents in one gulp. She scanned the label and immediately became even more horrified. You are consuming a stimulant to force your body to remain awake despite its biological need to rest? Ethan grinned. Yep. Kethery was struggling to process the sheer madness of what she had just witnessed. That is not a solution, Ethan. That is a temporary chemical override. He shrugged. Hey, it works. She felt genuine concern creep into her normally scientific approach. You cannot continue this pattern. You are actively damaging your biological functions. Ethan waved a hand dismissively. Nah, I'll crash eventually and get a full night's sleep. It's fine. Kethery was not convinced. This is why your species suffers from chronic exhaustion, is it not? Ethan laughed again, but this time, there was an edge of knowing acceptance to it. Oh yeah, big time. Kethery exhaled sharply. Your species should not exist. The breaking point. Over the next several days, she watched Ethan slowly deteriorate, his 3 hours of sleep turning into 2, then barely 1, until eventually, he was running on what she could only describe as sheer stubbornness and stimulants. By the 4th day, he was functioning at what could only be described as barely alive. His movements were slower, his responses delayed, his ability to process complex tasks diminished. He miscalculated ship diagnostics, walked into a doorway, and even forgot what he was saying mid-sentence. Kethery had reached her limit. She grabbed him by the collar and dragged him to the crew quarters, ignoring his weak protests. You are going to sleep, Ethan Voss. You have no choice in the matter. Ethan groaned in protest. I don't need dash. She shoved him onto the bed. You do. He sighed heavily, but as soon as his body hit the mattress, she could see the immediate struggle his mind was having. Kethery narrowed her eyes. Your brain is refusing to shut down, isn't it? Ethan let out a defeated sigh. Yeah. She could not fathom how his species had survived this long. Your own mind is actively sabotaging your biological needs. He let out a weak chuckle. Yeah, humans are weird like that. Kethery sat down in the chair beside his bunk, rubbing her temples. You are the most illogical, self-destructive species I have ever encountered. And yet, you continue to exist. I do not understand it. Ethan yawned, his body finally giving in to exhaustion. Yeah, neither do we. Kethery watched as his breathing slowed, his body finally shutting down after days of fighting itself, and she could only shake her head. Humans were impossible. And yet, somehow, against all reason, they thrived. She doubted she would ever understand them. But she knew one thing for certain: she would never stop being fascinated by them.